My name is Casey. I make cheese at Sugar House Creamery in Upper J in the Adirondacks, and I took a course at Sterling College that is presented in conjunction with Jasper Hill Farm. They host a consultant named Yvonne Larcher from France, and I spent 10 days with him at Sterling College talking about cheese making. So today was meant to be a share session. We don't have many people in the room, so I'll just go through the PowerPoint a little bit. And the focus on giving a workshop today is just kind of based on my philosophy that I think cheesemakers should be sharing their successes and failures a lot more often so that we can come to a place where we're understanding our craft in a deeper way. So the information that I learned at this course, I thought was brilliant and has, in the short time since, really informed my craft in cheese making. And we've seen huge improvements in consistency from batch to batch and just meeting our objectives. So anyway, I'm going to share that information. So the first slide up here is milk components, which if you've made cheese before or you're milking animals, we're generally familiar with the components in milk. And so I wanted to just narrow in a little bit in what those components then have to do for cheese making. So doing a quick breeze through on the components to then get to a later portion in the presentation to how we can talk about cheese. So water makes up the majority of what milk is. That then dictates that we're pretty much getting like a 10 to 17% yield on cheese. So you're losing all of that water content. So yield ends up being super important in cheese making so that you can be making your money back off of your cows because you're losing all of that water content. So within water, there's free water, which is considered extra micelle water. Micelle is a protein structure. So that makes up 90% of the total water. So this free water is really easy to drain. This is mostly the water that drains out in the whey when you are making cheese. And I'm going to go like a little maybe more advanced than not for this. But if you have questions, just hop in. And then fixed water makes up 10% of total water in milk, and this is intramicelle water. So this will be within the protein casing micelles, and this is much more difficult to extract in the cheese making process because that water is linked to proteins, mostly the kappa casein proteins. So acidification is what will end up loosening these proteins and allowing this liquid to drain itself out. Because a huge parameter in cheese making is managing moisture, depending on what your objective is, whether you want a high moisture cheese, a low moisture cheese, and then balancing for all the other components that are in your specific vat. Lactose, the sugars that are present in milk, make up about 4 to 5%. Those sugars are glucose and galactose. The sugars are going to be used as food by bacteria to help them multiply and then release lactic acid. And this begins the acidification process necessary to make cheese. They'll also end up releasing gases and aromas and alcohols, which will add to flavor development of the cheese and also appearance. So the aging and really the cheese making process begins with the degradation of these milk sugars. So the first fermentation of those milk sugars will consume glucose. The lactic acid bacteria will consume glucose and be producing lactic acid, but it'll leave galactose. So when it breaks down the glucose, this primary sugar, it breaks it down into citrates and lactic acid. But it'll leave the galactose. So when you're thinking about what cultures you're using in determining what cheese you want to make, you've got to be wary that you're fermenters, your bugs that are consuming those sugars, are not just homofermentators, that they're not just consuming the galactose, because they'll leave all of these unfermented sugars in your cheese, and then you'll deal with demineralization problems. It'll be like a more sour cheese, a more crumbly cheese, and then ultimately it's like money down the drain because you're losing calcium, you're losing fat, you're losing protein in your whey. So you want that primary fermentation has to happen where you're breaking down your glucose, but you want a secondary fermentator as well, which is something, if you're using commercial cultures, they will print you off spec sheets. And if you get one plus sign, that is a glucose fermenter. If there's two plus signs, it'll do both, so that you have a multiple fermentations, heterofermentators, they're called. So you want that, because if the secondary fermentation comes in, that'll break down galactose as well and continue fermenting that into acetic acids and lactates. So all of this is to get to a point where your cheese reaches whatever your objective is. But in breaking down all of these sugars, the cheese will be much more controllable. You'll know what trajectory the cheese is going in. You won't just make this hard cheese, put it in your cave, and have no idea what it's going to be after 6 months, after 1 year. And that goes for soft cheeses as well. It's just a little bit less scary because your feedback loop can be like 10 days to 2 months as opposed to 6 months or a year. And leaving residual sugars in your cheese then ends up causing all of these issues like demineralization, post-production acidification, and you just end up with a cheese that is not as tasty because not as many bugs have been able to multiply, populate, and then basically die and create these enzymes that are going to make your cheese tasty. Adding yeast to your family of fermenters is beneficial as well, because yeast will consume sugars in a different way. So in our hard cheese, we add in a yeast that will basically ensure the work of consuming those sugars in our hard cheese, so there aren't leftover sugars. Yeast doing the work on eating those sugars can prevent problems in hard cheeses like fissures, that you would cut your cheese open and there would be these huge breaks in it, which is not aesthetically pleasing. And then also, if you're breaking down that cheese into pieces to sell to customers, it's breaking apart. And then what is your customer getting for their price point? And then also in soft cheeses, those excess sugars will manifest itself in blue and black molds on the rind. So if you're doing a natural rinded cheese or a washed rind cheese, it's a lot more work for the cheesemaker or whoever's working on the ripening of the cheese, because you're constantly having to wash back those blue and black molds. But if you create the correct environment where all those sugars are being consumed during the acidification process, it'll be easy peasy and you don't have to fight those molds back. That was very exciting to me, because that changed our make for our soft cheese. And now, instead of having to wash that cheese every other day of its life, which is 2 months, I only have to wash it 3 times during that 2-month period. And the rinds are much more attractive, much more stable, much more consistent from batch to batch.
Because you added the yeast?
Because we added a yeast in, and because of just monitoring our acidification in a different way to make sure that we're doing the primary and secondary fermentation, and then adding in that kind of like safety of the yeast. So fat then. Fat is flavor, mostly in cheese. So this is 3.5 to 6%. The 6% going up there would be something like late lactation Jersey cows. Buffalo milk gets up there really high. Usually it's closer to that 3.5-4 range. So fat in cheese making ends up being primarily flavor, also texture, and then this French consultant, I like the word he used, sensation. So kind of just like mouthfeel, I guess is what we would say in, like pretentious ways in English. So if fat is handled well, basically from when it comes out of the cow until when it's in the cheese vat, it can be an excellent aroma producer. But fat tends to also be a disaster if it's handled poorly. Fat is what will end up giving off flavors. You'll have poor lipolysis, so you'll have poor breakdown of those fats, which can then manifest itself in like kind of spicy on the side of your tongue or a little bit sour. And then also too much fat will lend itself then to poor drainage and poor ripening, because it basically acts as a plug when you're draining. And this will show itself in ammoniated rinds, or in a soft cheese, a brown paste, and just rancid and off flavors. And when I often feel like in a Jersey milk cheese, you can taste those off flavors, which would be kind of like sharp and spicy are kind of the flavors that I get off there. And then also, if you're familiar with cows, that hoof rot flavor comes in there too, of just kind of like goes up into your nose and is agreeable to a certain extent and then not. So fat is something that has to be balanced with proteins. Our choice at Sugar House to milk brown Swiss is for many reasons, but one of which is that the fat and the protein ratio in brown Swiss tends to be balanced, and the fat globule size in the brown Swiss milk is much smaller, so that milk is more naturally homogenized, which is a huge player later when you are coagulating your milk, because the protein structures don't have to work so hard to wrap around the fat globules and encapsulate them. And so the benefits of having that balanced fat protein ratio is not only that you won't have off flavors due to too much fat in your milk, but also you won't be losing that fat that's not encapsulated in the protein in your whey. So the recommendation is to, in a way, kind of like manually standardize your milk. So if you're seasonal and your fat is really high at the beginning or end of lactation, skim that off and make butter off of that extra cream. Don't just lose it in the whey or lose it in your hard cheese just to become off flavors. Or if you are primarily just milking Jersey cows, which have a super high butter fat for the majority of their cycle, it makes sense to make two products out of that. You might as well get two products out of one, as opposed to destining that fat to either be lost in whey or to become a problem down the road. We don't milk jerseys, so I haven't done that, but the guy giving this course milks jerseys. He milks them once a day, so his fat is like out of this world. He makes butter and creme fraiche out of his cream, and then is able to make good cheese out of his milk. And so protein, fat and protein have to exist in a balance. Whey proteins make up 10 to 15% of total protein, which is usually between 2.5 is kind of on the low side. Ours always tends to be around 3. 2.5 to 5% would be the total protein as far as components go. And then 10 to 15% of those proteins are whey proteins. So they will be evacuated during drainage. And that's then what you would make ricotta out of. So those are proteins that you're not trying to salvage in your cheese making process. And then the sugars in the casein matrix, in the protein matrix, degrade into lactic acid, and then they release, or I guess the better word would be like dissolve. They dissolve the minerals that are holding the protein structure together to make that protein more workable. So your acidification, like your monitoring of your sugars and your understanding of like where your sugars are and your acidification then comes into play with your proteins. In that, the acidification is going to allow those protein structures to open up and then be workable to become cheese. And I guess a big part of protein then is understanding your protein, and this kind of comes from a herd management point of view, and looking at we send off milk samples once a month. So we end up knowing what our milk is every 2 weeks because the state does a sample for us then. So we try to counter that with our own sampling. You can also do in-house tests to figure out like what the strength of your proteins are. That's an expensive apparatus on the farmstead level. We're trying to not do that. We're trying to just understand our herd is a closed herd. We milk 12 cows. And so being able to understand that through what we're feeding them and then also monitoring their milk, knowing where our protein is at can then guide us into making changes, small minutia of changes on the make day to make sure that we're getting the right yield and then ultimately down the line hitting our objective with our target measurements.
What are the kinds of changes you might make if you see different protein levels?
So I'm going to get into it a little bit later, but basically knowing the strength of your proteins is important. So proteins can be really high in your milk and also your fat is really high. And then you can pretty much you can standardize how much you're acidifying and how much coagulant you're using and end up with your same objective. If protein structure is high though, and fats are high with it, but those proteins are weak. And so for us, this happens late in the summer when cows are really tired, their milk urea nitrate is a little bit high. Those proteins are there and they're showing up when we're looking at proteins, but being able to interpret what's actually going on with the herd, we know those proteins are weak. And so we'll add more starter culture and we'll add more coagulant because those proteins need a lot more help. They need more help being able to release themselves and then form a matrix around whey and fat to become curd and whey. That's an example. And then, within total proteins, you're looking at your proteins that are going to be destined for your cheese, your soluble whey proteins, which are going to evacuate, and then also looking at MUN. MUN is information that always comes back when you're testing your milk, which is milk urea nitrate, and that basically dictates how good your cow's diet is. So if they're getting too much energy and not enough fiber, their MUN will be really high. Milk urea nitrate, basically how I understand it is that nitrogen is like the building blocks of protein. And so if that nitrogen is high in their system, they have all this potential protein in there that isn't able to form, and so they're like pissing it out basically. So they're not at the right balance of a diet. So you probably have to up fiber, and we feed grain, so we can balance protein percentage in what our grain is. Essex doesn't feed grain.
I think just a little.
Yeah. And then minerals. Minerals is less than 1%, but to me in this workshop, it was mind-boggling to discover that no one I have learned to make cheese from expressed to me how important minerals really are just in the chemistry of making cheese. And so now looking at our cheeses from the perspective of calcium, which calcium and potassium end up being the most important minerals that are present. They're hugely important. It's the glue that keeps the proteins together that you need to work and loosen up. And then it ends up being the bridge that connects all the proteins to one another to encapsulate fat and make a strong coagulum for your cheese making. So I was really excited to learn about minerals, which we'll get into. But basically that ends up being the glue of your matrix. And then if the bond is formed correctly, it aids in proper drainage to reach your objective. And then, so within minerals and looking at calcium, there's two different types of calcium. There's colloidal calcium, which is 66%. And then there's ionic calcium, and ionic calcium is basically like floating around. It's free. That's going to drain out in your way. And the 66% of the colloidal calcium is what will function as the glue. And retaining that calcium then dictates what your final cheese is going to be. And determining how much of that calcium you want to keep is based on what your ultimate objective is. We'll get into it. I'm going to go to the next guy. So the bugs. Acidification is super important in what cheese making is. Looking at all of those components, they all have important relationships to acidification, and acidification happens from little bugs. A lot of us in this region are working with raw milk, regardless of whether then we are pasteurizing it. It's still important to understand where all of these initial inoculations are coming from. And it's everywhere, this is why ruminant animals are exciting and cheese making is exciting, is we're slowly inoculating our milk with bugs from every part of the process. And so this is where selective pressure starts for our cheese. So this is where your objective begins, is as far back as the feed for your animals, or as far back as the genetics of your animal, or as far back as just what your animals are. Are you milking goats, cows, sheep? And selective pressure, that idea of just creating the environment in your milk for the cheese you ultimately want. And like the steps on from that are creating an environment in your cheese for the rind you eventually want, creating an environment in your cave for the flavors you ultimately want. So I liked that language, that idea of selective pressure, basically to create the perfect environment for the bugs that you want and to create a hostile environment for the bugs that you don't want. A woman who gave the presentation there put this all together. So I guess I got a little Venn diagram that we were going to kind of do as the bits. And kind of looking at these components that go into where you're sourcing your microbes from. Because often in cheese making, we'll just talk about the environmental microbes or like the native microbes, and then we're talking about commercial cultures we're adding. I know that they culture their raw milk stuff at Essex with like Flora Danica, right? And that's a commercial culture that we're buying in. So those are controlled bugs that we're putting into our raw milk, which is already this habitat for all of these native bugs. So where are those native bugs coming from? And I guess we could brainstorm. We're so few. But so the animal itself, how does the animal affect the components and the microbes that are in the milk? And one I mentioned before was your breed. So our breed is brown Swiss, balanced fat and protein. Breeds can have higher fat. Some breeds even have less buffering capacity for things like listeria. So that's a smart thing to look at when you're choosing the breed of goats that you're using to make cheese. I can't remember which one it is. Maybe it's Nubians. They have lower capacity for buffering for listeria, which is kind of interesting. And then within breed, it's selection. So when you're looking at herd management, what line of cow are you going to keep? Where they're at their lactation is going to be significant for what components you have going on. The cleanliness of their udders. Some cows keep themselves really clean. Those are probably cows that you want to keep in your herd and maybe keep their progeny as well, because then you have less work as the milking person to keep their udders clean before you're milking them. And then their age and seasonality. So whether you're milking year-round, whether all your cows are at one point of lactation. And then animal husbandry was another one. What would go into this is the feed, what you're feeding animals, your milk handling, your milk practices. And udder health. And a huge one is your pack, your bedded pack. We live in the North Country, so our milking cows are not outside all the time. And if they are, when they are outside, what are they laying their udders in? Are they in mud? Are they in barnyard? Are they in pasture? And we keep our cows in a bedded pack with pine shavings that we muck twice a day every time they're in, which is a lot of labor, is not necessarily a practice that happens at every farm. But we do it because we know that our ultimate goal in our cheese is to not have any barnyard taste, obviously to be free of pathogens, and to just have a really clean milk the whole way through, and a clean flavor also that comes out. So the pack is hugely important in those, for basically what ends up being components in your milk and also microbes. And then the environment, what season is it? We always have higher positives for listeria in our creamery in the springtime, just because everything's like all of a sudden alive and wet, and they're always traceable, they're always cleanable, we can always clean it back. But just knowing that you have a livelier milk depending on what season you're in, I think is important to think about. And that goes with temperature as well. What's going on in your creamery. We don't have a temperature controlled creamery, so when it's really hot in the summertime, our cheeses really take off, so we know we have to balance our acidification in that. So there's a whole bunch of places where you get your bugs from. Just starting there. And then I guess I was just going to talk about fat and protein here, which I guess I kind of did before. That high fat is really something that is great when you're selling commodity milk. You get good premiums for it. But when it's destined to cheese making, you've got to be careful for reasons we discussed before. Too much fat decreases your yield, so it's counterintuitive, right? You get a better price point for that high fat when you're selling commodity milk or premium milk, but you lose that fat in yield because the proteins can't form a strong coagulum around them. So all of that work you've done to make your cows give a fatty milk, you lose it in your way unless you're holding it back, unless you're keeping it. And then that high fat also causes defects in the cheese later on then, if it's volatile, if it's been handled poorly, even if it's been held in cold storage for too long, which is too long is like over 2 days, which is kind of crazy. And then in the cheese making process, it acting like a plug, so you're not getting the proper drainage, so you won't end up with the cheese that is your goal. Yeah, and we talked about nitrogen. So I guess in this, it's just herd management. And I think a lot of folks around, we're grass-fed, but we supplement with grain, which is a couple cheesemakers in the area that choose to not do that. So they're grass-fed cows, and they have like lines that have been bred to be grass-fed cows. But something that he brought up that doesn't really pertain to us is cows with acidosis. So if there's like low fat, basically that there's not enough rumination time is happening. So the rumen would be high in acid, meaning too much energy, not enough work, and you'd be having the same problem as when you have too much MUN, that your protein structure is really weak. So with that, you want to fix that diet issue with the cows, allow them more time to ruminate. Maybe you have to switch your schedule of when you're milking, basically to strengthen those proteins so that you're getting a better yield in your cheese. It's not like an anemic protein. That's a course. It's called Obsolim. That I know more about cheese than I know about dairy cow management. But there's a course. He's a vet from France that observed cows for decades, and it's called Obsolim, Observation Alimentaire. And it's a super cool, like, non-invasive way to observe your cows and understand their, like, basically their dietary needs from really small, nuanced observations, like, are the hairs along their spine all sticking up? And what does, like, the crust under their eyes look like? And you have this deck of cards that you're able to look at all these symptoms and then address what's going on in the herd. And through that practice of making these observations, you're able to be preemptive in troubleshooting any issue down the road, and you're able to preemptively change diets as seasonality and the metabolization from cows going on pasture to going on hay. You can be preemptive in, like, catching that before it becomes an issue. If you ever see that workshop, come to the US, you should go to it. So tools and techniques, this was a big part of the course. What we talked about was just, as farmstead cheesemakers, we have a lot going on. But if we're able to set targets, so it feels like exhausting to record all of these things, and we don't record all of these parameters, but to regularly record measurable targets and to set those targets, you'll have a lot more consistency in your cheese. And then ultimately in the long run, you're saving yourself a ton of time, not having to troubleshoot, not having to figure out how to market a cheese that went a little crazy in your cave. So setting those targets and taking the time to be pretty meticulous about measuring them and recording them pays off in the long run. Big time. I brought a copy of our make sheet at Sugar House that are all I can show this to you after, that are all the notes that we take when we're making cheese, measuring acidity, measuring for moisture, or more so taking notes on moisture, where fat is at, and salt. That has helped our cheeses a lot. The more information that we put on our make sheet, the easier it is to just record all of this and then be able to be preemptive in troubleshooting a cheese before it's made, and troubleshooting, figuring out what happened with the cheese if it comes out with a defect. This is not something cheesemakers often share, that we have defected cheese, but even the, like, huge producers of, like, Gruyere, Comté, and, like, Jasper Hill Farm, they still have defected cheeses that they have to figure out what market they're going to sell them to. So selective pressure and measurable targets coming in here. The selective pressure, again, creating the environment that we want for the cheese we ultimately want. And measuring targets is worthwhile, a worthwhile practice to establish, because you can make adjustments on the make day and not have not even a ruined batch of cheese, but an off batch of cheese. And then also having these targets keeps you on track as they drift over the long term, so that you're staying consistent with your objective as years go by, or at a place where you have a ton of interns coming in, a ton of hands touching the cheese. If you have these targets, you're meeting these targets, and if you're not meeting these targets, the cheese batch gets flagged, so that you know it's going to be something different. Maybe you have to harvest it early. Maybe you have to find some cheesemonger who will take a super stinky runny batch because you didn't drain out enough moisture. So in measuring cultures, rennet and pH, that seems to me and to us at Sugar House to be the most manageable measurement we can do on a farmstead scale. So we use pH, potential hydrogen in your milk, and we use titratable acidity as well on the Dornick scale. So titratable acidity is like this really manual, you use like phenylephthalene that turns It turns milk pink as you're putting bicarbonate of soda in. So it tells you the titratable acidity, also sometimes said as total acidity. It tells you what you have in your milk as far as lactic acid and acetic acid. So it gives you a better understanding of what your level of proteins and minerals are in that milk. pH is measuring acidity of milk based on the hydrogen ions that are floating around in the milk. Milk is negatively charged, your acids are positively charged, and you want to get them to like the middle neutralization ground to have a successful cheesemaking process. So in choosing your cultures, that has to do with what you want for your ultimate goal in cheese, but also this is kind of the first step in food safety as far as cheese on a farmstead level goes, because we're not standardizing our milk, we're not pasteurizing our milk, or we are in some cases, but for a raw milk cheese, you can look at this step as technological hygiene. And so the idea of that is that you're looking for the correct multiplication of bacteria to get the acidification that you want. So you're basically contaminating your milk with these cultures to make sure that acidification reaches a certain point by a certain time, and that you're protecting it with these bugs that you're choosing for your selective pressure, not bugs that are just self-inoculating. And then why monitor? Like, why? Sometimes it feels like you just are like, I'm milking cows and I'm making cheese. Like, why the hell do I need to do all of these things? It helps you understand your ultimately measuring pH and acidity, helps you understand coagulation, later texture, what drainage is going to look like, your aging outcome, and also it's a food safety measure. So it's worthwhile. And I guess an example here of acidification moving too quickly and acidification moving too slowly. So a lactic cheese is in the family that you're basically making a yogurt, and you're letting milk acidify until it forms just like a big coagulum of something that looks like yogurt. Usually people do it in a bucket, and then you'll either ladle it, scoop it, or like pour it into bags to drain it and make a cheese. And in a lactic cheese, if the acidification goes too fast, you lose all of your calcium. So you have a really poor structure, and a really poor contraction is called syneresis in cheese. So like the proteins being able to contract, they can't really do that because the calcium structure is gone. They have no bonds. And so you have poor drainage. So you'll end up with a really wet cheese, but it's also a cheese that's really demineralized. So before that cheese is ready, before it gets a rind on it, it'll be super dry, really chalky, probably a bitter cheese, not really tasty. So that's if your acid really takes off. If acid is too slow, you have to, if you're monitoring everything that's all these bits that are going on in your creamery, you would know whether you have to change your dosage. It would mean there's more buffering capacity in your milk, which might be a seasonal issue because your milk's really lively. It might be a problem of high MUN. High MUN means a different buffering capacity. There's too many like floaty proteins in there, basically. Look at the dosage from the culture house. Maybe that changed, or a bacteriophage, which would mean that you need to do a big overhaul and look at what's going on in the creamery and cleanliness practices, and probably bring in totally different bacteria. But if your acid is too slow and you continue the process of making cheese, similarly to the first one, it's going to be too wet. But it's not going to be too wet because of poor drainage, because of loss of calcium. It's going to be too wet because all of that calcium is still there. The calcium hasn't really gone anywhere, so the bridges are too strong. And then your proteolysis, the breakdown of your proteins, is going to be really poor. So that's why there's bad drainage. It's the polar opposite. But this wet cheese, when your acid is too slow, is going to end up staying too wet in your cave. And then you end up with a really runny cheese. You can barely turn it. You're not going to be able to package it. And you're sure not going to be able to like bring it to a farmer's market and sell it to somebody because it's going to be dripping through the package. So that's the example of lactic cheeses and why it's important to measure your acidity and be able to stay on those targets and have those parameters. And then for in the other side of cheeses, enzymatic cheeses, which are coagulated by rennet, which is a semi-soft cheese, or can be hard cheeses as well. But in this example, it's a semi-soft cheese. If your acid takes off and goes really fast, your acidification gets to a point much faster than it's supposed to. That then starts to come back up, and your protein breakdown will be uncontrollable. So it'll be the same kind of outcome, that your protein breakdown is happening from the outside in instead of happening homogeneously. And so you have a real stinky cheese that's really runny around the edges and real chalky through the center because you had a problem with your acid. And if it moves really slowly, what we found is like it ends up with the texture of like a baby mozzarella. So something that's just like not pleasurable, really dry, still an eatable cheese, still a saleable cheese, but not our target objective. So if it's when that acid is then moving really slowly, same idea. The proteins haven't loosened up enough. Those calcium bonds are still really strong. And so you're ending up with all of this residual moisture that then ends up evacuating, and you end up with a dry cheese. So kind of counterintuitive in some circumstances, but and then measuring moisture, looking at moisture. We don't have a measure of moisture because that's also a really expensive machine. You can get one recommended, but you can only test it like once you've made the cheese. So it's helpful in setting targets, but ultimately our practice at Sugar House, because everything's hands-on, is just much more so by touch. So we record moisture on our make sheets. You know, if the batch felt really wet, I'll write that down, and then I'll make an adjustment for the next make that I need to work more moisture out of the curd. Fats and solids, we also just know that based on our milk reports, and we on our make sheets record when cows are fresh. We're not seasonal, so we milk year round. So we'll record who's fresh, how many cows are fresh, and where they're at in their lactations, to anticipate whether we have high fats or balanced fat in the milk, because then that would also implicate what we're doing as far as acidification and coagulation time. And then salt, we brine all of our cheeses, and measuring salt, it would seem, like it would just be as simple as your cheese is undersalted or oversalted, but I think that's like a very culinary way of thinking about it. That is important, what the ultimate flavor is, but salt brings enzymes with it. So if salt itself is actually a flavor enhancer, so when you're brining that cheese, that salt is penetrating the cheese and bringing all of the enzymes that it brings with it, helping with the breakdown of the cheese. It also deactivates the starter cultures. So any of those microbes that have been inoculated into the milk, the salt will slow them down, or totally, basically puts them to sleep. It's not killing them, but totally puts them to sleep. So you're salting your cheese can stop that acidification curve. It's a preservative, so it's a food safety measure. Ends up being moisture control as well. So it'll, wherever your cheese is at and that moisture level, it'll hold that moisture in. It's a selective agent. So another moment of selective pressure comes there with your salt, and what salt you choose to use, how you choose to salt your cheese, whether you're brining your cheese, dry salting your cheese. We add salt to our milk for our lactic cheese. And so whether you're choosing sea salt or like commodity Cargill salt, these are also moments of selective pressure. Temperature is an easy one. Everyone can do temperature and figure out what temperature does. This chart has everything to do with calcium. So acidification to me is this very important aspect of what we're doing in cheese, and the reason to record it, measure it, track it, and have a target for it is that without the acidification, you can't manipulate proteins and you can't manipulate the calcium. And without being able to do those two things, you can't get to your objective in cheese. You're kind of just like crossing your fingers. And so this chart, I want to be able to draw on there, but I can't draw on there. You can't do that. So this chart just basically discusses acidification. So if we look at the vertical axis of low moisture and high moisture, a high moisture cheese is going to be a soft cheese. A low moisture cheese is going to be a hard, dry cheese. And retaining that moisture does have a lot to do with the size that you are cutting your curd, the amount of time that you're stirring for, the temperature that you're going up to when you're cutting, but it also has to do with the structure of your proteins and the strength of your calcium bonds, which when I had learned cheese making, I understood it to be that if I had a big curd, then I would end up making a cheese like a gooey taleggio. And if I had a tiny little rice grain curd, I would end up making a cheese like a Parmesan. And within that, there's some truth, but that big fat curd, if you don't have the right drainage, if your calcium bonds are off, whether they're too strong or they're too weak, you can end up with a cheese that's really hard and chalky, even though you kept all this moisture in the curd and you're like, where'd all my moisture go? It left because the calcium structure was weak. And you could also make a big fat curd and end up with a cheese that's like really gooey, like Mondor or Winnemere from Jasper Hill, that's like this liquid goo inside if you pull it off right and your calcium bonds were strong and your protein structure was strong and your matrix was right. And same on the other side too. You can cut these kind of like pea-sized curds and end up with something that is really nuanced in flavor and dry in texture like a Parmesan. Or you can end up with something that's hard in texture and has no flavor to it. And that is all based on where your protein structure is at and what your calcium bonds were looking like. I feel like the guy would like opened my mind to that. So basically the acidification is going to start to loosen the bonds within the casein micelle. And the calcium that is linked to the proteins, which is the colloidal calcium, not the free ionic calcium that's lost anyway, this starts to become dissolved in the whey. And to a certain extent, you want that acidification to happen so that the proteins can be primed for coagulation and for that then like forming this matrix and making curds and whey, but not too much. So it's this right balance of what you want your acidification to look like before you're adding rennet and then before you're forming your cheese into cheese. And so as the lactic acid bacteria creates acidity, basically that micelle is absorbing hydrogen and the calcium is leaving. So there's this like electrical exchange that's going on. And to control calcium, we're controlling drainage and through controlling that contraction that needs to happen for drainage, that we're not having to force it by stirring a curd, and then you're just losing it in your whey. And also that calcium holds the proteins together, so then that ultimately will be the texture of our cheese. And so then this horizontal line is texture. So low acidity, when you're doing a really slow acidification curve on your cheese and you're basically hooping your cheese, you're molding your cheese, hooping your cheese before acid has taken off, when it's still like 6.0, you'll have a really elastic cheese, so a really soft cheese, like really bendable, kind of pliable cheese, something more like a Gruyere as opposed to a Parmesan, which is very friable that would crumble in your hands. And when you're on the other side with the high acidity, so acid has really taken off, then you end up with a chalky cheese. And chalky like sounds, all of these things like sound unattractive when they're at their farthest poles. But to kind of like place the family of cheeses in there, a low moisture hard dry cheese, you wouldn't necessarily want anybody that's right there. That would be kind of feisty, but somebody who's really close is Parmesan. And then a high acidity, high moisture cheese, so something in here, closer to the chalky side, which sounds like unattractive, would be Chev. So Chev is a really high acid cheese. You want that high acid early on in its life, but you're also keeping a lot of moisture in there, and that's happening through your monitoring of draining. So Chev, there's an accent somewhere, maybe like that, goes in there. And then for a high moisture elastic cheese, something that would go in this family would be Winnemere is kind of like a commonly known cheese now from Vermont. I guess another one is Mont d'Or, which is a real gooey thing. Anything that's like wrapped in wood and you slice the top off of it and you can like spoon it out. Or something in here would be like a Taleggio. It's hard to be a left-handed person and write on these things, you know? And then something that is lower moisture, low acidity. This is our goal for our pound cake, which some people have had. And pound cake is modeled after a reblochon, a French reblochon. So that's also in that category. Reblochon. And our pound cake actually usually falls closer to here. We'd like it to be closer to this like elasticity and moisture, but just based on what our cave is, we're coming to terms that it exists like in this realm, whereas reblochon can kind of exist like in these two spaces. And so looking at this, like at these axes, kind of helped like me put it into perspective that there aren't defected cheeses, you know, and there's no point in your process that you're like, oh shoot, a high acid cheese, now what am I going to do? But instead it's the ability of the cheesemaker to set those targets and set your objectives and then to just follow through with them. Because if you're trying to make a Parmesan, but you end up with a high moisture Parmesan, it's not going to be Chev, you know, just not going to happen. So trying to figure out where you're at and thinking about that through calcium to me was really like hugely important. So we started adding calcium chloride to our milk, which we hadn't done, just with the belief system that why would we add this ingredient that's not ours when we are like milking our own cows and the only thing we're adding are microbes and salt. Like, why add calcium chloride? What is it? How to make it work in our process? And after taking a course with Yvonne and him kind of like explaining like what is calcium chloride, and I feel better about it being safe. It's just like, you know, it's like in this liquid form, so I wasn't sure what it was, you know. And then also when to add it in your make process, which would be 1 hour before you're adding rennet. It basically aids your colloidal calcium in staying within that matrix. So at our farm, we don't make cheese every day. So we make cheese twice a week. So our milk has to go into cold storage for basically 3 days. Every third day around about we're making cheese, which is long storage. And we're not about to start making cheese every day. We don't milk enough cows for that. Our scale is different. So in that long storage, you start leaking calcium. The calcium within the protein structure starts leaching from being colloidal into being ionic. And so there you have this like one step of already you're losing your calcium. And then heat treatment as well. So our pound cake and our Little Dickens are pasteurized, not because we don't believe in raw milk, but because of New York State and FDA regulations. And so that heat treatment also affects calcium. So that's another step where you're going to be leaching all of that calcium. And then acidification. So the reasons for us adding calcium to all of our cheeses is for different reasons. The long storage affects all of the cheeses. The heat treatment affects our soft cheeses. And then for our hard cheese, it's a raw milk cheese. And we've looked at its microbial content through a microbiologist at UVM, and it has a lot of thermophilic starter cultures that are native to the milk. And so it's a really lively milk. So our acidification is a little bit difficult to control. So we add the calcium to basically buffer that, knowing that we're losing all of this calcium to start with, and wanting this more elastic texture in here, a like little bit higher moisture, elastic texture. We're adding the calcium chloride in, which ultimately increases yield. And you can see the difference in the way. So when you cut the curd mass, and calcium is really low before we started adding calcium, just different in our winter milk tends to have a higher calcium than our summer milk. I don't really know about that science somewhere. But the whey after those first cuts is really clear, not cloudy, and a really vibrant looking whey when we're adding the calcium. And when calcium isn't added, it's really cloudy. And so we're not doing these tests to later then see like what our yield is. We're not measuring milk and then measuring, like weighing cheese to figure out what our yield is. But you can see that without the calcium, you're losing all of these proteins. You're losing all of this fat because this cloudy whey is going off, which is an ideal way to make ricotta out of. But that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep all of those proteins, fat, calcium within our cheese to make a tasty cheese. So basically this just is showing that the more calcium you lose, the chalkier your cheese is going to be. And that's not necessarily a defect. It's just what is your objective. And our objective for all of our cheeses is that they'll be more elastic. We find it like more appropriate to the family of our cheeses and like what we want to taste in our mouth ultimately. And then I was just going to share, I guess, the acidification and how it affects calcium. So in 3 stages, what's happening with acidification is that first it's the neutralization of caseins. And this is caused by the development of like positively charged hydrogen ions that are the lactic acid. And they're basically having a magnetic reaction to the kappa caseins, which are the protein, which are negatively charged. So milk is starting at this negative charge, and as you're acidifying, you're changing that charge, wanting to get to the isoelectric phase, wanting to get to the middle range, basically, and that's why you measure pH, and that's why we measure titratable acidity. It'll show us what it's balanced there. So that second step then is the demineralization of proteins. And this is when the calcium ions react with the acid and migrate out, becoming soluble, becoming ionic. So that demineralization there, you're controlling by how much acid you're using, in what amount, what types of bugs you're adding. And then the third phase would be the dehydration of water linked to the kappa casein. So earlier in components, part water is made up of fixed water that is attached to the kappa caseins, attached to the proteins. And as this water is able to like basically drain away from that, because you've changed the electrical charge of milk, then the caseins can attach to one another and aggregate and use the calcium phosphate bonds as links. So all of that in there, just looking at like basically acidification is changing the charge of your milk. And because calcium and the proteins have a charge themselves, that's how you're affecting them. Because milk is electric. Boogie woogie. And then this is the last one. I like this chart. It helped me like conceptualize how to figure out how much calcium or how much rennet to be adding to cheeses based on what cheeses we're wanting to make. And so basically over on this acid side, that's where lactic cheeses would reside because they're primarily coagulated by lactic acid. We make a lactic cheese, we add a tiny bit of rennet to it just like for good measure to make sure that we're getting the right acidification. And then over on this other side is where hard cheeses would reside. So hard cheeses, you're not acidifying them almost at all when they're milk. You're coagulating them through the use of rennet. So you're going to have a much higher dosage of rennet. Can I draw this? Yeah, pretty much. And so far over here on the acid spectrum is yogurt. Yogurt's solely coagulated by lactic acid. And then farther over here on the rennet side, without any acidification, he's French. He wrote jellified milk. So that's like junket. And in French, it's like blancmange. We don't really, it's like panna cotta almost. So it would be just like this gelatinous, like really high moisture, like milk custard kind of thing. That is not cheese because no drainage would happen because no acidification is happening. So you're taking fresh milk, the proteins aren't able to break down, those bonds, those calcium bonds are not loosening, so they're not able to form. So you're retaining all of that moisture in there, nothing's happening, and you end up with jellified milk, which I kind of love that. But if you allow acidification to happen within a controlled measure, then you end up with a tasty hard cheese. So the difference here being when it's a hard cheese, you're draining, then molding, then acidifying. And then over on the other side where it's acid, you're acidifying, then molding, and then draining. So the example there of a lactic acid cheese, you're like making that yogurt, you're molding it into its individual molds, and then you're letting it drain. Whereas a hard cheese, you're draining off that way from the curd mass, then you're molding it up onto the table, and it's when it's on the table that then the pH starts dropping and becoming the cheese that you want it to be. So this again is rennet, and your choice in rennet is another moment of selective pressure. We use a French company called Berthelot. It's a pretty small company that's making rennet. I think one day we would like to use our own rennet, but we would want a lab to tell us what the percentage of chymosin and pepsin is in there to tell us what enzymes would be acting on our milk. Because knowing the enzymatic potential of your rennet is significant then in cheese making, to know that they're basically cutting the right way. And so I don't think I need to go into that. So in determining rennet, and like the reason it's important to measure your rennet and be pretty fastidious about that is that it is like all of the enzymatic activity that you need later on in the development of your cheese. And so the most important factors in achieving the correct action of your rennet is the pH, so where the acidity is when you decide to add rennet, what the temperature of that milk is, and then also what your dosage is. And when you're troubleshooting, or when you're trying to figure out, like, I didn't get the right coagulum on that, or my flocculation time was off, temperature is the last thing that you want to change. And the first thing you want to change is the flock factor. So flocculation is like that first moment where milk starts to go to jelly. And determining your flocculation time, again, is like, there's no, the first person that I learned from was like, you want flocculation in 15 minutes, and then you want to cut 15 minutes after that, no matter what cheese you want to make, which is not true. And so your flocculation time, which we determine by putting a knife, a blade, any kind of piece of metal in the milk, and when it goes from milk to you seeing like it almost just gets like a little bit more viscous, that's the flocculation time. The flocculation time is not when the milk is hard, when the milk is firm, when the milk feels like jelly. You've missed the flock time. So when you're setting your targets, just really being on top of the milk and like keeping a knife in there, it's a little tedious, and noticing that kind of like snotty moment of the milk and recording that as your flocculation time. And flock time, depending on what kind of cheese you're going to make, can be anywhere from like 5 minutes to 30 minutes. And then next would be your hardening time. So the hardening time is then how long you want, basically how firm you want the curd to be before you're cutting it. And that's based on what cheese you're trying to make. And so the hardening time is an X factor. You're determining that based on what your cheese is. And that can be a very short time, up to about a factor of 8. So a factor of 0.3 would be a hard cheese. So a hard cheese, you want a longer flock time. So the rennet is, you're adding a lower dosage of rennet. It's taking a longer time to act. And it would be about a 20-minute flock time that you would first notice that snotty milk. And then the hardening time would be really short, so almost nothing. So the enzymes have had a long time to act, but it's not a really firm milk. Usually you can put your hand on the back of the milk and feel like your hand would sink in like a mattress. And if your hardening time is only a 0.3, it still feels like milk. It's really scary to cut. But all those cheeses like Beaufort, Gruyere, Comte, all those big beefy French cheeses, they get cut at a flock factor of 0.3. We cut our hard cheese at 0.5. And then to figure out your cut time, you're going to do your flock time plus your hardening time. And that's how you get there. So, yeah, right? Does that make sense? Your flock time, you're going to do whatever your flock time is times whatever your factor is, and then ultimately come back. So if it's taking me 20 minutes as my flock time, and then my hardening time is 20 minutes times 0.5, that's 10 minutes. So my total cut time is going to be 30 minutes. So 30 minutes from when I first added rennet is when I'm going to cut for that cheese. For our soft cheese, we want a flock time of 15 minutes, and then we want a hardening time of 2.5. So it's a much firmer curd. It's a much longer start to finish cut time. And that's like because of all of these variables of wanting the correct action of the enzymes, the right kind of like unraveling of those proteins, a different acidification. Our soft cheeses are going to fall more in the middle of acidification, and just adding enzymes as coagulant. And so that is all determined by just what your objective is, and figuring that out and kind of conceptualizing like where you want your acid to be, how strong you want your calcium bonds to be. So to me, it's the idea that the lower your flock time, short flock time, higher hardening time will be a softer cheese, and a higher flock time, lower hardening time will be a firmer cheese. And knowing in whatever rennet you choose, that rennet continues acting throughout the process of cheese making. And that's basically when I was saying troubleshooting, this flock factor is what you want to change first. So the amount of rennet that you're going to add throughout For us, it's throughout the year, or this would be seasonally if you're milking seasonally, depending on where your proteins are at, where your fat is at. That's how you're going to determine how much to change your rennet. So we are usually changing our rennet just twice a year. So when cows metabolize the change from being inside on hay and going outside on grass, there's a big metabolic change, and we change rennet in there. So we usually, at that time, it fluctuates throughout the summer that we're increasing and decreasing rennet. And the reason that we know to do that is because we'll see a cloudy way. So we know that we're not getting the right coagulin, we're not getting the right acidification, we're not getting the right calcium bonds. And so before we make a change and say, I think previously my interpretation of it was if you weren't getting a firm enough curd, you needed to raise the temperature, you needed to just raise the amount of rennet. But looking at if you have your targets and you know what your flock time is, or you want your flock time to be, if your flock time doesn't get there, you can like salvage that batch of cheese by changing your hardening time. So if your flock time, you want it to be 15 and it ends up being 20, your flock time is already changed, but you've got to figure out the math to keep it within what you want your parameters to be. But ultimately, the temperature is the last thing that you want to change, because acidification will continue, and that will really affect the enzymatic activity of the rennet. You want to change things like hardening time and dosage before you change any like manipulation of the milk. I got like a super nerdy thing, I guess, too, which is, I guess this is like stuff that can be shared too, but this is just like what it looks like, what rennet is doing, basically. Rennet is able to selectively break down a kappa casein. It picks where it wants to cut along the chain of proteins, it breaks it there, and so then it exposes a neutral charge that the calcium is ready to bond to. So that neutral charge of all of these micelles that have been broken down is then changed, and then that is what allows all of the proteins to come together, because otherwise they're like floating in a soup. And basically adding that rennet is what allows them to agglutinate, come together and form a glue. Yeah, that's that bit. So basically my big takeaway, and there's like so much information that this guy gave that was really, I think, empowering in cheese making. There's also like a massive packet on troubleshooting and defects, and a big workbook that if anyone wants to like contact me, I can share it, but I can't just like upload it and share it. And I think that I'm interested in like a world of cheese making where we share our knowledge, because it's so incredible. I'm a super like nerd about it, I guess, and feel like I know very little about it. And we've been doing this for like 5,000 years, and we still know very little about it and how to like arrive at making a cheese consistent from batch to batch, or at like allowing our consumers to understand why it's not consistent from batch to batch. I think we could go one in every direction, but I'm gonna like sign off and say I hope that information was information, I guess, that it was like useful or could be useful, or anyone wants to talk about it over eating some defected cheese, we can do that. Yeah, so that's it. You want questions? You want to?
Do you have any questions that might be good to have on the video before I stop the recording? I have a question on behalf of somebody else.
Yeah.
Which has something to do with a 60-day period, which enables raw milk cheese to be deemed safe or okay? What?
It's pretty arbitrary, the 60-day rule. Basically just the regulation that we're under in the US is cheeses have to be pasteurized if they're going to be sold before 60 days of aging. And the thought on that was that at some point they did a study on cheeses, on soft cheeses, aged under 60 days that were made of raw milk and found a certain number of listeria thriving there.
Okay.
But previous to that, the 60-day rule, I think, is based off of a lot of research that they did on cheddar, which is a really unique cheese. It falls into its own category, and then they just expanded that to incorporate all cheeses. So cheddar, listeria, and other pathogenic bugs will thrive in cheddar until those 60 days, and then cheddar is a really high acid cheese, so those bugs will be consumed by the time it's safe to eat, basically. So the 60-day rule is unfortunately just something that we're held to in the US. And I worked for cheesemakers who have tried to subvert that and basically cold age their cheese to get it to 90 days, cold age raw milk cheese to get it to 90 days. We can't do that either. So I think just in designing the cheeses that you want to make, if your belief system is really in raw milk cheese, then plan to make it be over 90 days. Because now what studies are coming out with the FDA and state by state are saying oh, now that cheese is a little more popular and we're doing more research on it, 60 days is actually the most dangerous period for whether it's pasteurized or unpasteurized. And it's not until it reaches 90 days that it would be safe from pathogens. So to me, it just comes back to that, this slide of I wish that we could exist in a system where farmstead creameries are saying we know exactly what's going on. We know what our feed is. We know what our pack looks like. I know what my employees' hands look like when they're washing these cows. We know what our udders look like, and say that our milk is safe because of that, and then our cheese is safe because of all these parameters of no boots in the creamery and our really strong food safety program. But unfortunately, we live in an industrialized society where we have to follow suit with what Kraft and Chobani are doing. So we have to pasteurize our cheeses that are under 60 days for now, at least, and we'll see what else they do.
Is Chobani up here?
Chobani's New York, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They're not Adirondacks, but they're in New York. They're our other big thing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, food safety, paramount. Food safety and selective pressure, I think that's I wish that those could go onto our food safety plans as parameters and just say I created an environment of selective pressure for positive bacterial growth in here, so we're good, because that has been the belief system of cheese until the 1950s, and I guess pasteurization, 1920s. So it's pretty new to us that we're standardizing milk on a farmstead scale.
Thanks, I'll pass that on.
Yeah. Yay. Thanks.
I think I missed it, but I think you said it. At what point do you acidify after you test the pH and the titration?
So I got my make sheet here, and we test the pH of fresh milk. So when the milk is coming in before it's been acidified to know what we're starting with, we test the pH and the titratable acidity. And our pH is usually really high. We're making raw milk for sale. And so if we were making, I think, just cheese milk, we might want it to have a higher bacterial load, not contaminating it, but our milk is super clean. So we have a 6.74 as a starting pH. And then I will test pH and TA and titratable acidity again before adding rennet. And we want to see a 0.2 drop. So we want to see it go not any lower than a 6.66, something like that. But it could go down to a 6.5, high 6.5. And titratable acidity, you want to stay the same in those two periods. And then we'll test pH again, pH and TA again after we cut, to just see what the acid is doing. And for Dutch knuckle, for our hard cheese, we don't want any acidification. We want that little bit of a drop right in the beginning, and we want no drop throughout the whole renneting process. We want the TA to show a difference of going from 18 from the starting milk to about 10, and that will show us that we haven't lost any significant amount of protein. I wish I could draw a chart of like what TA is in relationship to pH, but I don't have, I'm like not, I'm only equipped with that knowledge as it pertains to our cheeses. And then we'll do pH again as we then cut that curd and cook and stir it for a half hour. And then we'll take pH again when we're draining it, and TA again. We want them to stay the same in that realm, but the pH can drop another 0.2 and it's still within what we want it to be. And then we'll take pH 6 hours. Then we're done with TA because TA only is liquid. So then we'll take pH after 6 hours, and then we'll take it after 12, basically like before bed, whenever before bed is. And then in the morning again before we brine it. And that's when we want to see, like within that 12-hour windows when we're going to see the drop, that it goes from about a 6.5 or 6.4 to a 5.2 or a 5.1. So that's when all the acid happens, when it's already like a formed cheese out on the table. And then the pound cake is a little bit different, that it acidifies more slowly while it's still in the milk and curd form. And then a little bit quicker on the table, but it stops at a higher pH. We want to brine it and move it into the cave when it's at a higher pH, so like a 5.3.
So a lot of the places at which you test the pH and the acidity are for monitoring purposes. They're not because you're going to take action and change the acidity at that point.
Right. We wouldn't, if we took the pH before renneting and had seen that from starting pH until before renneting, the acidification had really taken off, then I would be monitoring a lot more what was going on with the rennet, because my suspicion would be that the rennet would act a lot faster and I would have a much harder coagulum, and so I would cut earlier than I usually would to make sure that I'm not like losing fats and proteins. But ultimately, if that was happening in that monitoring phase, if the acid had really taken off, I would want to know a lot of things, like if somebody sucked up manure or something, like why the milk was so lively. Basically what was going on. And if it was like raining outside, that's always a thing, like things are more lively when it's wet. I would probably ask like whoever had milked last if anything had happened, or if the machines were sucking air or something, just wondering like what that microbial content was. And I would make a note just for that cheese later on that it didn't hit our targets, and we'd probably harvest it early. We wouldn't allow it to age out for a whole year. So that saves us like labor, money, space in the cave. And then if we harvest it at 3 months as opposed to a year, and it's not a super tasty cheese, then that cheese we still sell it at our wholesale price, but we would sell it to a chef. So then that cheese is not like going on a cheese table or being cut into individual pieces that reflects like what our cheese is. So keeping all of these like monitoring systems then helps us just like with traceability in the cave, and who's destined to like live in the cave for a year and who only gets 3 months, stuff like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you go to school for biology?
No, I went to school for early childhood education.
Wow.
I don't know any about this. I only know about these things like in terms of cheese. And
like my passion.
Yeah. Biologist of passion. Kind of. It's like alchemy though, right? Cheese is like alchemy, right?
So easy to follow. You explain things so well.
Preschool teacher. I did bring a gnarly cheese. I was hoping maybe people would be here to see it, but I brought a cheese that's an example of textures or acidification taking off. That's really funny, and then trying to salvage it.
Oh.
But this is old at this point, so we're not selling it anymore. But this is our pound cake, which I don't know if you've seen that before. It's like an orange rind cheese, kind of squishy. And this one I made when the cows had really high MUN. And so I didn't know that their protein structure was really weak. I was like, how would you know? It's invisible. So I was just making cheese, like as we make cheese with our, like this flop time, this hardening time, that amount of rennet, that amount of culture. And because the protein structure was really weak and I had lost like all of my calcium, the acidification really took off. And so this cheese suffered from post-production acidification, that basically the acid dropped lower than I wanted it to be before I even caught it. Because if we're recording it at 6 hours, it went below 5.2, probably down to like a 4.9. So it got really acidic, but then it starts to go back up. Like that isoelectric charge changes again and it starts to go back up. So when I took the pH of it, it was at a 5.3, which is where we want it to be. But then it became clear, like when it comes out of the brine, it just felt like a little softer than I thought because drainage was really poor. And so this cheese is like really soft and gooey around the edges because the proteins are breaking down from the outside in. They're supposed to break down from the inside out. And the center is like white and chalky because all the acid like stayed in the center.
I love cheese like that once, and I was wondering if it was supposed to be like that.
Yeah.
I don't think it is.
Yeah. Do you want to take this to Essex and you can cut it open and see what it looks like inside? So then to salvage it, I knew that it was going to be a cheese that instead of staying like taut, like our pound cake, it was going to go like and start like gooing out the edges, and it was going to have an ugly rind because you basically like in all of those issues. I created like a poor selective pressure environment for the rind that I wanted, so the yeast weren't able to thrive. So instead, this dry kind of like Penicillium and Geotrichum funguses thrive, as opposed to these yeast that make like an orange, sticky, tacky rind. Because of where the pH was at, those yeast didn't want to thrive, and this wanted to thrive. So I wrapped it with cheesecloth, and I bound them, and I called them bound cake. And we sold it, and people let you slice off the top and then you like eat the insides out. But it's not the cheese that we want to sell like as our product, you know? So I think I'm at a point in cheese making now that I'm like, I get it. Somebody was like, take this milk, make cheese. I can make cheese. But what thrills me is making our 3 cheeses consistent from batch to batch and like thinking about it chemically, electrically, scientifically. And then within that, instead of, I've worked at places before where if they have a batch that's not up to their standards, they'll like toss it to the pigs, which I can't, like, that's unacceptable to me. We've never done that at Sugar House.
Really?
You know, that's like, to me, it's like the cows have done so much work. This land has given us so much. And like, I'm going to fuck it up and make a bad cheese and have to throw it away. So to me, it's like any of these like measurable targets to me are like so worth it to then be able to know before this is a problem and we have to throw it to pigs, that is salvageable. It just needs to like change its trajectory. And I mean, I think if you're not aware of any of that, like you are going to end up with bad cheese that you have to throw to pigs. It's like not edible, you know?
Did you come up with the 3 cheeses that you all sell?
At Sugar House, I went to France and did an apprenticeship and took basically a recipe for Pélardon, which is a cheese from southern France, to make little Dickens, and then the recipe for Reblochon to make pound cake. And we like, you know, altered them to be like 4-hour milk and 4-hour space. And so they're distinct from those French cheeses. And then Dutch knuckle is a cheese that comes from a recipe from a place that Margot and I both used to work at. Okay. And so the Dutch knuckle is the one that we both had received instruction from the guy that came up with that recipe that was much more based on like following a recipe instead of like designing targets to reach an objective. Mm-hmm. And so that cheese, and making a hard cheese is the most difficult to be consistent from batch to batch at a farm-fed scale year round. And so that one has always been kind of like, it's an awesome cheese because we make awesome milk, but we wanted to understand it a little bit more. So that one was the real like catalyst for me wanting to take this class, was to just like understand that cheese more, for like textural reasons. And when we have like, I guess, defects in that cheese. wanting to know like why and what that is, and like maybe a defect isn't a defect, it's just like what that cheese should be, you know. So yeah, they're all like our own recipes at this point, which feels kind of cool. The Little Dickens when Sugar House started was a very different cheese, and this one just is like much more thrifty. It works better in our space. So it's like a sturdier, a lactic cheese is a really delicate cheese, and we age all of our cheeses in one cave space. And that's a big like testament to creating selective pressure in the individual cheeses, so that then when they're all in the same environment, microbes aren't like one on top of the other. Like the Little Dickens has a very different appearance from the pound cake and the Dutch knuckle, and that starts with like the vat being at the cheese vat and creating that life for them. But yeah, now at this point, like they had like come from like textbooks or people we had worked with before, and at this point they're all our own recipes, which is kind of cool to understand them differently.
Wow.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, guys.
Hey, thanks, Casey. Good talk.